Well, good afternoon. From everything I've heard from the moderators and participants and our partners, there's a lot of energy going on today in the Wilson Center, which we will capture. And I want to thank again everyone for coming to the event. There's someone out there who has this book, and in it are my notes for the... What? So if that person would like to come forward and introduce the panel, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ring. It's a red folder, and just please see me after the symposium to return it. I'd appreciate it very much. We have 4 distinguished rapporteurs who have slaved through their sessions, both in Evolutions and Revolutions, and in Vision 25. So to my left, I'd like to introduce Chip Walker. He's our Senior Policy Analyst in the Policy Planning and Learning Bureau. And next to him, Wade Channel, who comes from our Economic Growth Office, and he's a Senior International Trade Advisor. And to his left is Tim Resch, who's the Bureau Environmental Advisor for the Africa Bureau. And finally, Bill Colglazer, who we're delighted to have here as well, from the State Department, who is the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. So thank you, all rapporteurs, and we're looking forward to your comments. I want to make one slight change in the agenda. So the rapporteurs will speak very briefly for 5-6 minutes. Don't expect that they have synthesized everything that they've heard, but they'll certainly give you the highlights. Following that, we'll hear from Leon Firth, who has years of experience in helping move from discussions to actions, and we'll get his insight. And then Larry Garber will join us up at the stage along with Leon to wrap up the session. So, Chip, over to you. I think the mics will work. Whatever you
They do.
Okay. Is it working? All right. Well, I had the privilege of sitting through 3 very interesting sessions focusing on population, and actually moderated the third and final one. For those of you who were not part of that particular session, it sort of proceeded in a series of levels or layers. So the first session focused primarily on demographics and demographic changes, got into questions about aging. About aging populations and different kinds of age structures. Then the second one, we sort of added to that question issues about urbanization and some of the effects. And then the third one sort of layered on top of that all of that previous discussion, and then added a discussion around governance and sort of the governance implications. So rather than sort of summarize them one by one, I just wanted to pick out a couple of themes that sort of cut across all of them. I think the first one was that in looking at this sort of set of issues, sort of characterize it as sort of one person's challenge is another person's opportunity. So there was a lot of discussions in all of these things about how these various kinds of trends and so forth might play themselves out. So, for example, on the one hand, obviously there was some discussion around the association that exists between large numbers of youth and violent conflict. But at the same time, the argument, that's the challenge that particular age cohort plays. But on the other hand, sort of a recognition about some of the qualities and capabilities that young people have in terms of entrepreneurship, and in terms of sort of creating economic growth and the opportunities around that. Similarly, one of the issues around climate change and urbanization, as many of you probably are aware, there are many of the largest cities are in coastal areas, and due to sea level rise and so forth, the expectation is that that's going to be something that they're going to be contending with. But the observation was made that the way in which those kinds of cities are going to be contending with those particular things is not as sort of a gradual creeping up the side of a house of water levels, but rather as the result of a catastrophic storm, which is going to lead to large-scale displacements and so forth. Capability in the millions, given the difficulties that we have had in Haiti. If you can imagine something, a huge storm hitting Dhaka, Bangladesh, for example, and the kind of displacement that would be occurring there. But the observation was made in our second panel that may be a challenge, but one of the things that we maybe want to be thinking about is that as we think about the concept of displacement or settlement camps and so forth, do we need to think of them as essentially camps, or are they potentially proto-new cities? And how do we think about designing those particular kinds of camps to absorb large numbers of people, and perhaps using different kinds of organizing principles to build into them issues around, thinking about schooling, thinking about how they might actually become self-sustaining in terms of agriculture and water, and using leveraging new kinds of technology so that you don't have to be thinking about putting in large forms of infrastructure. So that was one issue that sort of came up, is that there are these challenges, but there are also these opportunities. Another issue that sort of came up was some challenges to the conventional development models. The one that it came up in bits and pieces across all of them, and that is the fact that when we think about demography at the moment, we're very much preoccupied with young people. But the reality, one of the other things that is going on is that we are in an aging society, and as I think one of our panelists called it, the gray tsunami. And we have seen that particular kind of trend already happening in the global north, in North America, in Japan, also in Russia. And it poses a number of challenges. It poses challenges in terms of what this does within the internal sort of generational transfers, and whether or not these kinds of states can support the traditional liberal economic model because of the imbalances in terms of populations of those who are on the sort of the receiving end and those who are on the giving end. So it causes those internal questions, but it also was the question is that if you look at where those kinds of aging populations exist and where and their consumption patterns and so forth, they all tend to be in the countries that are also development donors. And so the question was raised about, in terms of the global development bargain, are the states that are currently sort of entering into, if you will, demographic middle age, those tend to be the BRICS type countries, will they be willing to sort of take on the responsibility for the global public goods that essentially those that have the aging populations have been willing to shoulder, at least since the end of World War II. Another obvious issue here is the fact that all of these things, there's a great deal of interconnectedness between a lot of these issues, and it's very difficult to sort them out. And indeed, I think one of the things that was sort of implicit in this is the needs for all of us who are engaged in these things to think more in terms of transdisciplinary kinds of ways, and developing analytical tools that are supportive of that particular kind of an effort. For example, one of the things that was pointed out is that although there are a number of aspects about urbanization, but in terms of family planning and other kinds of activities, governance and so forth, it's actually in some cases easier to deal with urban populations because they are in concentrated spaces than it is if you're dealing with a widely dispersed population. So there are these interconnections that we need to see. One of the interesting observations to me was the fact that when family planning activities have been successful, they have generally been treated as, they have been pulled out of the health sector and understood as a broader social problem. So that was an interesting question. The two more quick points. One of them was on questions about whether, it goes back to this question about the models that we are currently investing in and whether or not these will continue to be good models going forward. And this particularly became true with respect to the investments that we're making in governance models. And I think there was some real questions about whether or not the next 15 or 20 years may see continuing threats to the nation-state system, whether or not you may end up seeing different kinds of governing arrangements. The state may still be there, but whether or not either but at the local level, localized level in terms of self-organizing and so forth, but also at the global level, because oftentimes people don't have quite the same degree of attachments to localities and so forth. And so this is, again, raising another challenge about whether or not the sort of liberal model that we're investing in is either going to survive or is really going to be in the best place to do it. But I think the concern was also that some of these more pessimistic visions as to where governance may be going may suggest that the governance arrangements will be increasingly less able to respond to the problems that a lot of these other challenges are facing. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say was something about what this implication was, because the question came up, obviously, about what does this do for a development agency. I think that one of the things that I heard almost everybody saying was how pleased they were that USAID was organizing an activity of this sort, and that they hoped that this wasn't going to be the only opportunity to sort of look beyond the next planning, next annual planning cycle. But I think that one of the interesting questions that this raises is that if we need to think about increasingly how do we as a development agency think across across disciplines, across sectors, and so forth, and how do we develop not only analytical tools, but it seems to me that every time we come up with an issue, we can't sort of reorganize ourselves bureaucratically. So how do we develop within a bureaucracy that tends to be organized on geographic and other kinds of levels meaningful ways of working across these areas, and not only in terms of sort of analytical agendas, but also ones that can support activities. It is not unremarkable that one of the major pieces of work that two of the major pieces of work that we've been working on in the Policy Bureau, including one that we're working on right now on youth, were all very much products of cross-agency working groups that actually were the genesis for this particular kind of a thing. So it just sort of poses challenges as we need to be more agile and address these problems going forward. How do we find internal solutions to be able to support this work?
And thinking through the evolution-revolution thing, I must make this one brief note that didn't exactly come up in our meeting, but as I look across this distinguished panel that I feel privileged to be a part of, I would say our evolution towards gender balance is a long way off. I think we still are working on that. Anyway, a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to hear Don Steinberg this morning start with the discussion of Harry Seldon. We had a project in EG called the Seldon Project that was in fact named after Harry Seldon, so we're particularly fond of that. But I liked his point of the foundation, and the foundation being a place where if we notice the past and if we notice patterns, we have a better chance of, if not predicting, at least guessing less stupidly about the future. And I think our first session brought a lot of that to bear. That as we were looking at patterns in development and in changes in the global economy and politics and the way we approach them, one of the things that became clear is that working with the Westphalian nation state at the national level is no longer sufficient. In fact, it may be both too much and too little. There was a good bit of discussion of how the work must engage government, yes, but which government? Regional bodies that have taken on somewhat of a governmental position, national governments, local level governments, as well as engaging directly with citizens, with the individual, focusing at the individual level on some of our work, which is difficult when you consider how much management that takes, but there are ways about it, as well as private sector players, civil society players. That the old model of working with the executive because of its efficiency may not be a very wise approach over the longer term, and that we are in a place where we can take a very different approach, including more direct work for economic purposes with legislators or city councils as well, and expanding the voice of the various players within society beyond just a centralized national government, but to a much wider number of competing voices who can push for the kinds of changes that are needed in governance, accountability, that will lead to greater economic growth and economic stability. Some of the trends facing us we recognized, and I'll note this, I'm actually trying to stay honest by keeping a timer on myself. My wife will tell you that I talk a lot. The trends facing us include increasing competition for resources, whether that's land or water or various commodities, widening inequality, the gaps that we see, and burgeoning demographics, which came up in our group, not as often perhaps as the population group, but sometimes one wondered which group we were in. These, as Chip just said, also offer opportunities, and that's especially true in the deployment of technology to continue the alleviation of misery and insecurity around the world, which is our mandate. Technology is not the solution per se, but we find that we have much more knowledge and many more tools to do much more than we used to do, and we're in a transition phase of figuring out how to use those, communications technology being very high among them. In working with countries, we also concluded that there's a mandate to help them integrate regionally and in accordance with their market potentials, recognizing that food insecurity is a function of markets or the lack thereof, that food insecurity is frankly a function of governance, not technology. That technology is available but is not often being deployed because of the situation in which those who would like to produce more find themselves if they do so. It's not always profitable. We didn't specifically discuss this, but we do know that sometimes technology results in price collapses and bankruptcy when not combined with the other aspects of markets and governance that help to get the economic returns that were intended. We looked also at the revolutions and disruptions that we can anticipate, just mentioned, and the knowledge that we have to create some shock absorbers at the macroeconomic level with a number of ways to prepare ahead of time for greater resilience of national governments as well as international organizations and international, not treaties, but relationships to sort of assuage some of the shocks that may hit, because they can set back growth very dramatically. A short-term shock can cost 4% that took 2 to 3 years to gain, and it's too dangerous just to continue to ignore those possibilities when we have a better sense of where they're coming from. In looking at the future, there is a chance to recognize some development trends for USAID that are quite important, and one of those trends is we are graduating countries regularly. We have a number on the block now, and by 2025, we'll be 10, 15 more out. And those graduates, that's a success story. We can congratulate ourselves, I suppose. But these will also, many of them will become donors or partners, or like the BRICS, countries that actually have resources. And one of our mandates today is to begin to consider how we will work with them tomorrow to achieve what we will have an ever-decreasing budget to do. And particularly, there was a large discussion of China and its role and the need to engage China. We may disagree with some of the governance issues, we may disagree with the approaches, but we can either compete with them and possibly lose in some countries. You'll note that. All right, timer is done. I actually gave myself 2 extra minutes because I knew I'd go over. Yeah. So we will compete with these folks. Actually, I think you said an hour each? I'm almost there. We are going to have to coordinate, cooperate, collaborate at times, as well as let's be real, there will be competition. But our mandate as we look ahead is how do we engage those partners, the private sector partners, trilateral work as well as international work. What can we leave behind? It was recommended we could leave behind Marshall Fund type organizations, Luso-American Foundation type organizations that continue work. Perhaps some of this takes congressional permission. South-South investors are outpacing ODA. Is that a threat? No, not really. That is a reality that there's some improvements there that we should be capitalizing on. Essentially, then, we came to the conclusion that our challenge is to widen the team over the next, not just 12 years, but 25 years and longer, forge strategies together and make changes today that will define the tomorrow that we want.
Yeah, I'm Tim Resch, Africa Bureau. I've been in the business for about 30 years of my 40-year career. About two-thirds of that has been in the Africa Bureau, and all of it has been in the environment sector. And so at the beginning of this administration, we commissioned in the Africa Bureau a publication reviewing 30 years of USAID investment in Africa in the environment sector. We called it Protecting Hard-Won Ground. I want to frame the discussion about evolution as basically, part of understanding our history. And it's in that 30 years, and some people here in the audience look like they've also had a number of years in the business, is that change has happened. What we're doing today is different than we were doing 10, 20, and 30 years ago. Somehow we learned lessons, we tried things, we failed, we succeeded. We're working in a different suite of countries. The BRICS were formerly USAID recipient countries. So we are graduating countries. 25 years from now, I think we'll still be in ROC and CAR. And Somalia and some other countries. So we're not going to be out of business, but we are going to be doing different things in different areas. And so so part of the observation is that the past is prologue of we got to understand the past, and we'll know what to do in the future. The other side of that is change is happening. Today's world is different than last year's world, and it'll be different from where the world is 5 years from now. Two things came out of observations, or something that came out of the evolutions conversation with us, is whether or not we are predicting climate change, getting ready for climate change, anticipating climate change. And another set of speakers were, hello, the climate has changed, the climate is changing, and the climate will continue to change. The African Biodiversity Collaborative Group, one of the groups I work with, they said, climate change is not a destination, it's a journey. And we're going to have to be continually adapting to climate change, and they make a distinction between coping with climate change and adapting to climate change. You cope with whatever cards you are dealt. We coped with the earthquake here in Washington, D.C., but we should be able to anticipate the hottest July ever recorded in the Washington, D.C., and the coldest October, and the wettest and wet August. I'm going to stop there. Revolutions. We identified a couple things that are happening that we're going to see more of. One is the One Health, the zoonotic diseases, the linkages between livestock, wildlife, and human health. Infectious diseases. That is going to is shaping. AID has strong programs there. It flowed out of the SARS, avian influenza, West Nile, other diseases and coming. So that's part of one of our futures. Another future is integration, is that the stovepipes are past history, and so the linkages between land, food, water, energy. I mean, if you're going to deal with water, you're going to deal with energy. You're going to deal with food, you're going to be dealing with water. You're going to deal with energy, you're going to be dealing with land. And so stovepipes are passé. Urbanization. Africa in 2012 will join the rest of the world in being more urbanized than rural. 25 years from now, those trends will even be greater. What we're talking about is transformation of the agricultural program in Africa and worldwide. And cities may be more energy efficient. And there are some scales of that. One of the indicators of development is a reducing percentage of the economy is agricultural. An indicator of development is there are fewer farmers. And we're going to move those trends. And then women and the role of women in education were all three revolutions that we saw happening right now. On the Vision 2025, the one soundbite was that we are a bilateral agency in a transboundary world. And how we deal with that, whether that's through our support to regional institutions, and the discussion was that linkages with regional institutions is with the other donors, the multilaterals, and how the regional institutions support countries, and how AID supports regional institutions and supports bilateral countries, and such. We will, in 2025, we will probably still be into capacity building, and other federal agencies on the whole of government side. Some of us may be nostalgic for USAID when we were the 800-pound gorilla in the room and we had all of the money, but that's not the case anymore, and it probably shouldn't be the case. We have our capacities, our skills, and a number of other federal agencies have those skills, have those mandates, and have developed those kinds of authorities. And the last thing on our vision is that we would have a new relationship with the BRICS. It was significant that we go from the G8 to the G20, plus linkages with the 77. And so in 2025, AID will be in a much bigger community. We will have a role, and that's just in the environment side. Basta.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to try to give you the impressions, at least from the 30,000-foot level, of three very interesting sessions on science and technology. There were many nuggets and wise insights that were provided. Let me begin by sort of giving a little bit of the overall context about science technology, none of which I think will be unfamiliar to any of you. First of all, science technology, as we all know, has totally transformed our lives. It's just incredible what has occurred through the advances in science and technological development. Now, the pace is so incredibly rapid that it's almost impossible to make predictions of what developments might be even a decade from now. And so that obviously presents a challenge for doing futures analysis, I think, as many people have pointed out today. But I think exercises like this conference and foresight-type approaches, I think, can be very useful to help us to expand our thinking. I think they help us to refine our goals, to enrich our planning. And what we hope it'll also help us to make wiser decisions today that will affect our future tomorrow. Science and technology are also great agents of change, and they're also great equalizers in society because talent exists everywhere. So I think that makes science and technology an incredibly powerful force for transforming societies and also for helping to solve development problems. I've been in my job for 3 months in the State Department, but my major observation in those 3 months is every country that I've dealt with, and it's been both in visits as well as talking to people representing various countries, the one topic they all want to talk about today is science and technology and innovation and the relation to economic growth. The reason for that is they all know now they're in a globalized and connected world. If they're going to have a prosperous future for their citizens, they're going to have to compete. And they see that the only way to be able to do that is trying to make advances and connect their people to science and technological developments, trying to create a more innovative, knowledge-based society in their own countries. They know they have very smart, entrepreneurial people, and so the way they're going to have a successful future is connected through innovation. And this realization is not just in the Brazils and the Chinas, the Indias and Singapore. It's a whole large set, additional tier of countries, Indonesia, Colombia, South Africa, Kenya, and it just goes on and on. These countries, even in this period of low economic growth, are making investments in education, investments in science and technology, and research and development, and trying to create more stable government policies that will help facilitate having a more innovative culture and ecosystem in their countries. So now capacity building, I think, in a very large set of countries is moving incredibly fast as well. And so I think this is a major new trend in development that, in a way, for me, leads me to optimism about the future. In our sessions, in the evolution session, it focused very much on the changes that are occurring from the ICT revolution, which you all are very much aware of, mobile devices and networks, the fact that there are 5.3 billion cell phones in the world today, which is 80% of humanity, which is truly quite amazing. The importance of the private sector, including local entrepreneurs, in spreading these technologies, which are truly empowering individuals. But also the importance of governments in creating an enabling environment, as well as making necessary investments in the commons, which companies are not going to make investments in, and making investments in the public goods. In the revolution session, it started out talking very much about all the revolutionary scientific and technological changes that have occurred, not only in ICT, but almost in every realm, from genomics, robotics, nanotechnology, everything that you can think of, and also putting it under the term of the democratization of science, which I think is a way of saying that now science and technology, even advanced science and technology, can be done almost anywhere around the world. There are also some very interesting examples, which I had not heard of some of the developments that are forthcoming. This one about smartphones being able to be used basically as a pathology lab for diagnosing diseases like malaria, which really sounded pretty neat. Also, this phrase, the vanishing threshold of software complexity, which means that it's now, using smartphones, it's able to create software with great efficiency, a much easier threshold for individuals to develop software. And of course, the great data explosion, and the fact that these devices are making it possible to analyze and use this data, and even for individuals to make use of the data explosion. In the 2025 session, I think, again, it illustrated why it's almost impossible to make predictions about technological developments, because the conversation focused almost exclusively on the general principles, which I think was a very wise way to approach it. So the discussion was on things like the appropriate role of government, the role of partnerships with the private sector, the role of universities. Development is a key aspect of international and national security. Also, the importance of trying to have ambitious but achievable goals and trying to lay those out for the next decade, as well as the importance of institutions that can change and evolve, especially to keep pace with the great empowerment of individuals, that these devices enable us to engage directly with individuals. So institutions like the World Bank also have to make changes. I was interested to hear how the World Bank now is working to be a much more open institution in every aspect of its operations, as well as also the importance of digital technologies being really enabling two-way communication, communicating with people, hearing what their desires and interests are, as well as lecturing to them. Although it was not part of our session, I was also very struck by the chief economist's presentation at lunch, where he talked about 3 different scenarios for the future, with the optimistic scenario being tremendous development progress continuing at this ever-increasing pace, democracy continuing to spread around the world. My feeling is, unless we mess it up, I think that is going to be the trend. So I'm very optimistic about the next decade, but how can we mess it up? Before coming to a second scenario, his third scenario was the increasing pressures on the planet coming from all the stresses of climate change, water, food production, the challenges. Because I'm an optimist about science technology. I think science technology is going to help us deal with these problems, and also help us to deal with problems that the politicians may be incapable of dealing with. But his second scenario was more conflict and wars, which, as we all know, are incredibly destructive. In fact, I think probably the most important thing over the next decade is for trying to avoid wars in these conflicts, putting a very high priority on that, because that, more than anything else, can really harm the scenarios that we like to envision of trying to make progress in development. And my very last comment comes back. I had to give several talks recently on the role of science and technology in the globalized world. The fact that the modern scientific revolution, as well as the evolution of democratic governments, they both emerged together out of the Enlightenment. The values that come from doing science, I think, are very congruent with the values that support democratic governments. They also help to create optimism about the future, which I think is important for all societies. So that, I think, the fact that science and democracy, I think, are very closely related, means that science technology is a very important tool for, again, trying to help transform societies not only in trying to solve their problems, but enabling them perhaps to solve their development challenges on their own. Thank you.
I'd like you to join me, please, in thanking our rapporteurs for an excellent sum up. That was not easy, so our congratulations to all of you. I'd like to, thank you. Yes. I'd like to call up our last two speakers. The first and the second, many of you know, Dr. The Honorable Leon Firth, who, okay, the Honorable former Dr. Leon Firth, who was National Security Advisor to Vice President Gore, is now a distinguished professor at George Washington University. Distinguished is okay, I'm told. And also a research fellow at the National Defense University. And Larry Garber, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Policy Planning and Learning. So if you two gentlemen would please come up. Leon will speak first, followed by Larry, and we'll get you out of here. This. Would you prefer to be at the podium? Yes. Or? Okay, great.
For those of you who have been bar mitzvahed, the call to come up to the podium sounds really hauntingly familiar. Would you like my father's name as part of the introduction? Right, thanks. Okay, you folks have been talking about the governance of others, and my whole life has been about the governance of ourselves. And the irony, the deep irony in this discussion is that we are unable to do for ourselves what you all would do for others. There isn't a single issue or a single question that you haven't raised that doesn't resonate if it were to be played simply inside the context of what the United States can or ought to do or may not be able to do to handle its own future, which of course is still a very vital question in relation to the future of the rest of the world. You know, one of the interesting things about our intelligence system, by the way, is that for quite good reasons, analysts may not consider domestic U.S. policy. A consequence of that is to produce studies which are attempts to look at the future of the planet, which eliminate the interaction between what we do and what happens elsewhere, and what happens elsewhere and what goes on here. In other words, a shadow is cast over the most essential transactions that one needs to be aware of in thinking about how the entire system operates. At any rate, I decided, sitting here and listening to these wonderful summations, that I will simply describe what I've been working on in relation to the governance of the United States. And I'm hopeful that listening to this as professionals, you may find things in it that are useful as means to expand your own thinking and get your arms around some of these issues. And I'm also hopeful that listening to it as citizens, you also find them interesting. It's amazing the freedom that you get after retirement, okay, to move on and think about what really needs to be thought about. Very briefly, so that you can understand both the context and the standing that I'm bringing to this, I spent more than 30 years in government, some of it in the Department of State, some of it on the Hill as staffers, and 8 of it in the White House, working for Gore as vice president. I always had a broad mandate, but in those 8 years I had a nearly universal mandate. I was empowered to sit on the Deputies Committee as myself, which meant I could speak as I wished so long as it was understood that I was not telegraphing the Vice President's future position. And I could sit on the Principals Committee, and after a time had that mandate as well. And I sat on both the National Security Deputies and Principals Committees and the National Economic Council. So I saw it all. And had I enough time, I would have engaged much more deeply in discussions of national science policy. Now, one of the things that happened towards the 8th year of this process is that I began to encounter surprises, and as a black belt bureaucrat, I didn't like them. I thought that I had it all scoped out. And these attracted my attention particularly because what was happening is that I was bouncing abruptly into issues that I thought that I had pegged as being in the longer term future. And here they were having snuck up on me from various directions as frontline present problems. I eventually began to conclude that major events, were accelerating. At first I thought the acceleration might simply be the consequence of my getting older and crustier, because you go back and read the maunderings of old men elsewhere, and it always seems as if things are moving too damn fast. But I concluded that they were moving objectively faster because they were driven by a process that objectively was accelerating. You might call it science and technology, but I specifically related it to bandwidth and the capacity to move data, without which the understructures for globalization would be impossible, and without which the implosion of forms of knowledge and the creation of new alloyed forms of information would be impossible. And I had a wonderful chat with a then science advisor to cross-check that impression, and basically he agreed. And when I left government, I decided I would try to see if I could organize this and teach it to young people, because it was leading me to the view that we had to find a way to extend our forward vision. I thought that the information systems that served the government at its top were pretty good for the short range, but very deficient in terms of what was out there, especially in view of the fact that what was out there was accelerating from prospective to actual under the impulse of this development. Okay, so I called this approach forward engagement. It was an effort to figure out how to spot what was on its way that we needed to pay attention to, in the hope that we would begin to devote resources to it sooner when the leverage on our investment was greater. I pursued that. And it eventually shifted into a direct concern for systems. I began to ask, what are the systems that support decision-making at the highest level of government? And are these systems adequate to deal with the rate of acceleration that I feel is underway? And that evolved into a different idea, very kindred, called anticipatory governance. And my conclusion in trying to figure out what would be the elements of anticipatory governance were, first, we had to do a better job of generating foresight, which means a better job of thinking about policy, but generating foresight and of linking it to policy. These are separate worlds, peopled by separate tribes. Policymakers do not understand foresight systems, and foresight people are very naive when it comes to the policy world. They don't understand each other, they don't understand each other's requirements, and the tragedy is that the policy people simply do not ask the necessary questions to get the best that they could have out of the people who do foresight. At any rate, foresight/policy was one of these systems that needed to be improved. The other was what some people call whole of governance. I think of it more in terms of coherence and laser light. That is how to, if you view the efforts of government as a series of discrete frequencies, the Department of Defense's frequency, the Department of Education's frequency, you name it, How do you get these things into a position where the frequencies add up and do not simply self-cancel? How do you get a coherent wave out of the energy that government is putting into its activities? The energy goes in as money and should come out as effect. Okay, well, if you spritz that money through executive agencies which have mandates that enforce an intellectual and operational isolation, you are not going to get coherence out of them. My best friend, since joining the academic world, now deceased, wrote his last book on the subject of distant proximities. Distant proximities is the concept of being mindful of how to recognize the links between what you think is far and what you are experiencing as near. We don't have that system built into government. It is a system. And so the middle element of anticipatory governance was coherence, whole of governance, management to mission as opposed to management to bottom line. And I think that's doable. And then the third element is feedback. Used to be an audio freak in the days when you built your own stuff. So I know all about feedback loops, and I know about the theories on which they're based, and I know that they are not present in the design of the government. Policies are approved by the president, remanded to the bureaucracy to be implemented, and then we forget about them until inevitably they no longer work properly, if they ever worked well at all. And we don't find out about this until reality collides with us in the form of scandal or disaster, or both. The alternative is, at the time of promulgating a policy, to rigorously ask what is it one should be looking for and who should be looking for it, as indicators that the policy is actually producing the effects for which it was designed and sold, and finding this out in time to be remanded back into the policy system so there is a political option for adjusting course, for capitalizing on what went right, and for recognizing the first symptoms that something is not going right and adjusting to them. Now, the thing that really has changed across the 10 years or so that I've been pursuing this is that the old rules, which gave some measure of understandability and predictability to the world, are dead. An understanding of the world as essentially linear with a low slope, completely misleading. The processes that we're into are accelerating, they are hyperbolic, they are in danger of becoming discontinuous. We have no experience in dealing with them. We are not somewhere in the gentle foothills of revolutionary change. We are deeply committed to it, except that we are taking our time in recognizing that that is the case. For example, there is no way in hell to return to the previous growth model of the U.S. economy. How could that possibly be? Back to cheap mortgages, back to houses nobody can afford, back to essentially buying out all the tchotchkes the rest of the world makes at the expense of employment for Americans. What are we going to do about this? The past is gone. Not only is it gone, but we couldn't pay for it if we tried. We have essentially burnt up the heritage that we had in terms of money to throw at our problems. And we have burnt up the heritage that we had in terms of time. Time to grope around, time to debate and tear up what was done before, regardless of whether it was good or not. If we can't change, we can't survive. We'll survive in some form, but it will not necessarily be onwards and upwards. It hasn't been onwards or upwards for almost 20 years in many ways, has it? In terms of the real incomes of Americans or the general trends in our education system, or you name it. So, it seems to me that many of these conclusions about the kind of governance that one needs in order to deal with accelerating change are clearly applicable to the problems that you face in thinking about the manifestations of this accelerant change in the countries and regions where you serve. But I'm here to say that they also are applicable in our own domestic lives, and there is a certain urgency about that. The circumstances under which we now operate are better defined by the dictionary meaning of the term chaos. A chaotic situation is one where, although you can imagine different outcomes, you cannot predict them. Okay? And the outcomes themselves are highly dependent upon initial circumstances. Now, what is happening is that it falls to us, those of us who have some influence over what gets done, it falls to us not merely to be making the next layer of incremental decisions, but whether we realize it or not, to be laying down the initial conditions of this new period. Okay? For that purpose, our existing approaches and systems are not adequate. They can be changed, but I can tell you after a decade of trying that it is not as simple as I once thought. I would finally suggest, having listened to your summaries, that this is not a one-way situation where people in the field should be glad that AID has finally been able to recover the ability to think about its future role. I think that the U.S. government should be glad, if it once thinks about it, that what is going on abroad now represents laboratory tests of all sorts of concepts about how governance can work under drastically changed conditions, and that there is a potential no longer for the U.S. sitting at the top of every heap to tell others how best to make these adjustments, but for us undergoing adjustments of our own to be looking at what you in the field can report back in terms of new knowledge for the future.
Leon, thank you for that wonderful summary of where we need to go from here in many respects. And so I'm going to close in a very brief time with a few remarks, and then, as Steve said, get everyone out for enjoy the beautiful fall day. About 18 months ago, I and several others were tasked with conceptualizing a vision for a 21st century policy bureau, to revive a policy bureau within USAID. And one of my compatriots was Chip Walker, who's sitting here in the front row. And he kept on urging that we make sure not to organize a bureau that was had a tyranny for the urgent. And I think that this conference, the day that we spent today, together with the day we spent about a month ago focusing on complexity science, is demonstrating that we are reviving a policy bureau that is able to not just focus on the immediate taskers that we're hit with, and we all know that they exist. Alex is smiling. He probably has a whole list of them back at the office. But that we do set aside time to think about the issues that are not the immediate ones that we're facing. And I think today was a great example for us to think and reflect, and to do so from a development perspective. As Steve said at the outset, there have been a lot of futures or foresight conferences that focus on that defense issues, national security issues in a specific sense, even diplomacy issues. And today we've really taken it from the development perspective, obviously informed by other aspects of our relationships with the global world, but I think that's important. And we as development professionals really need to have that space to be able to do that from time to time. In terms of what I heard from the rapporteur's reports and from sitting in on the sessions today was a lot of overlapping conversations. And I think, again, that was intentional. Even though we had 4 tracks and 3 themes, a lot of the words and issues that we dealt with in these sessions were similar. And it would be great if, based on the recordings, we can come up with a word cloud of sorts which would highlight what some of the key words were, but certainly I would expect big space for China, BRICS, technology, partnering, and governance would be among the bigger words that would emerge from the discussions today. And I think that's appropriate. And again, we need to think about what that means for us and what the challenges are for USAID moving ahead. And I'll just focus on one specific challenge that we confront in a day basis, and it picks up a little bit, I think, on what Leon was suggesting. We are trying and very consciously to revert back to a strategic planning-oriented agencies where we set country strategies for 5 years. We set benchmarks and goals that we're trying to achieve. And we really believe that this is critical to our development process. But we're doing this with the realization that this is a complex world, that there are scenarios out there that we cannot know where they're heading, that we need to be flexible. We need our strategies to be iterative in a sense and not get locked into them because the world is changing. And how we balance that need for strategic planning on the one hand with the reality of a complex world is one that we will take back and continue to discuss amongst ourselves within the agency and with our counterparts both in the government, in other donor agencies, and other partners. In terms of next steps, I think this was a great idea that our Assistant Administrator Susan Reichley had to link this conference to the Mission Directors Conference. We had a great number of mission directors participating actively in today's session, and now we're going to go off for 3 days of discussions within AID amongst our mission directors, where a lot of the themes that have come up today are going to be part and parcel of our discussions. We also need to reflect on the richness of today's discussions and create some space within AID, within the Policy Bureau, for example, to figure out how we take the lessons from what came out of today and apply it in practical senses. And I don't have answers right now, but I'm looking forward to lively discussions with my colleagues on these issues. We also want to invite a continuous engagement with many of the participants who are here today, some of whom came from far away, to help us with this journey as we move forward. When we issued about a month and a half ago our USAID policy framework for 2011 to 2015, we said at the time that this has got to be an iterative document. So even though we're putting down a framework, we're setting various benchmarks that we're aiming to achieve, we also appreciate that as time goes on, as we get closer to 2015, it will change in several respects. So that's where I take today's discussions and deliberations. We need to make sure that this is not just a conference where we had interesting discussions, but that we apply the lessons and understandings that emerge from it. So let me just close with a few words of thanks to folks who've played a huge role in organizing the conference, as well as those who've participated. I'll start with thanks to several people who aren't here. Our Deputy Administrator, Don Steinberg, for his, I think, quite inspiring opening remarks. Steve Radelet for his comments at lunch, and Leon now for his remarks at this closing session. We had, again, extraordinary number of panelists who came from near and far. Again, appreciate all of their contributions. The 4 rapporteurs who, again, as Steve said, did an incredible job of summarizing 3 sessions and kept to their time limits, which I really did appreciate. And then the people who are responsible for organizing. And I'll start with Alex Deegan, who's really provided the inspiration for his team to do the work on this conference. And again, he's proven himself in a number of these efforts to ensure that we have creative, lively approaches to dealing with very difficult issues. So I want to thank him, Stephen Fondreist, who was instrumental in conceptualizing the conference, Tally Faircloth in the back there, who did a whole bunch of things, including playing a major role in thinking through the approach to how we organize the conference. Jeff DeBalco and Kaylee Ober from the Woodrow Wilson Institute, Lynn Wills from the National Defense University, and Sue Nelson from the Department of State. And I think I'm missing someone. Yes, Steve Gale, who really has lived this for the last 6 months, has, participated in all our discussions about how we wanted to conceptualize the conference, has had to put up with, various little changes that we wanted to make in terms of the themes, but really has been exceptional in ensuring that we had a quality event with participants who were prepared for discussing these broad issues in a really concrete fashion, and has contributed himself to the subject matter that we've been discussing. So a big round of applause for Steve Gale and for all those who are here. And with that, I will adjourn the conference and thank everyone for joining, and go enjoy the fall weather. Did you say tchotchkes? I say tchotchkes. What do you think, Brian?